On the day after Christmas in 1944, in a snow-covered Italian village, an American officer sat alone in a stone house and called artillery fire onto his own head. He knew he would die. He knew the mathematics. He knew the blast radius, the fragmentation pattern, the kill zone, and still he gave the order. This is the true story of Lieutenant John Robert Fox, a man who chose annihilation over surrender, who calculated his own death down to the meter, and whose sacrifice was buried by his country for 53 years. If you want to understand what courage actually costs, stay with this story until the very end. And if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to this channel and writing in the comments below which city, state, or country you are watching from. Now, let us begin. The Apennine Mountains in winter are a place where the earth itself seems at war with human ambition. The ridges run like shattered vertebrae down the spine of Italy, each peak a fortress, each valley a trap. In December of 1944, the Gothic line stretched across these mountains, a belt of German fortifications engineered to stop the Allied advance toward the Po Valley and the industrial heart of northern Italy. Concrete bunkers clung to cliffsides. Minefields blanketed the approaches. Machine gun nests commanded every road, every bridge, every village square. This was not the Italy of postcards and vineyards. This was a landscape of frozen mud, of stone houses shattered by shellfire, of forests stripped bare by artillery, of men dying in places whose names they could not pronounce. Sommocolonia was one such place. A village of perhaps 200 souls in peacetime, it sat on a hillside in the Tuscan Apennines, its houses built from the same gray stone as the mountains themselves. The streets were narrow, the buildings pressed close together, designed for a world of donkeys and handcarts, not for tanks and half-tracks. In summer, the valley below would have been green with wheat and grapevines. In December, it was a monochrome study in white and gray, the fields buried under snow, the sky a low ceiling of cloud that seemed to press down on the earth like a thumb. The 92nd Infantry Division had taken Sommocolonia on the 26th of December, pushing the Germans back in a series of small, vicious engagements. The division was known as the Buffalo Soldiers, a name inherited from the black cavalry regiments that had fought on the American frontier in the 19th century. The men of the 92nd were African American. Their officers were largely, though not exclusively, white. The United States Army of 1944 was a segregated institution, a fighting force that preached democracy abroad while enforcing racial hierarchy at home. The black soldiers of the 92nd fought with distinction, but their achievements were often minimized, their casualties often unreported, their heroism often unrecognized. They were good enough to die for their country, but not, it seemed, good enough to be honored by it. Lieutenant John Robert Fox was 29 years old. He had been born in Cincinnati, Ohio, in May of 1915, into a world that offered black Americans limited opportunities and unlimited obstacles. He was a graduate of Wilberforce University, one of the oldest historically black universities in the United States. He had trained as an artillery officer, mastering the complex mathematics and communication protocols required to direct fire from guns positioned miles away from the target. A forward observer is the eyes of the artillery. He sits at the front, often alone, often exposed, and calls in the coordinates that will bring high-explosive shells screaming down onto enemy positions. It is a job that requires precision, composure, and a willingness to sit within range of the enemy while calmly doing trigonometry. On the morning of December 26th, Fox was positioned in a stone house on the northern edge of Sommocolonia. His job was to observe the valley and the ridgeline beyond, to watch for German counterattacks, and to call in artillery fire if needed. His radio connected him to the fire direction center of the artillery battalion, located 3 to 4 kilometers to the rear, well out of sight and sound of the village. He had a map, a compass, binoculars, and a field telephone. He had rations and water. He had his sidearm, and he had the knowledge that if the Germans came in force, he would be alone. The day passed quietly. The snow fell in soft, persistent curtains. The village below was still, the civilians long since fled or huddled in cellars. The American infantry of the 366th Infantry Regiment had dug in on the southern edge of the village, establishing defensive positions, stringing communication wire, preparing for the counterattack that everyone knew was coming. The Germans did not give up ground easily, especially not ground that controlled the roads and valleys leading north. Sommocolonia was tactically insignificant in the grand sweep of the war, but in the microscopic geometry of mountain fighting, it mattered. Whoever held the village controlled the approach. Whoever controlled the approach could move supplies, reinforce positions, launch attacks. As the afternoon faded into evening, Fox settled into his observation post. The house was cold, the windows shattered, the roof partially collapsed. He could see his breath in the dim light. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward freezing. He checked his radio, confirmed his connection to the artillery fire direction center, and waited. Waiting is the dominant activity of war. Waiting for orders, waiting for movement, waiting for the enemy, waiting for something, anything, to break the suffocating monotony of tension. The Germans came at night. It was the logical choice, the tactically sound choice. Night attacks in the mountains offered cover, confusion, and the element of surprise. The German forces in the area were a mix of Wehrmacht regulars and Italian fascist militia, men loyal to Mussolini's rump government in the north, the so-called Italian Social Republic. These were not the elite panzer divisions of 1940. These were garrison troops, older men, boys too young to shave, conscripts and zealots, but they were still dangerous, still capable, still willing to kill and die for a cause that was already lost. Fox heard them before he saw them. The crunch of boots in snow, the low murmur of voices speaking German and Italian, the metallic click of rifle bolts being drawn back. He moved to the window, keeping low, keeping quiet. In the faint starlight, he could see shapes moving through the streets below, dozens of them, perhaps 100, advancing in loose formation toward the American positions on the southern edge of the village. They were infiltrating, using the narrow streets and stone buildings as cover, trying to get close before launching their assault. Fox reached for his radio. His first instinct, his first responsibility was to warn the infantry, but when he tried to raise the command post of the 366th Infantry Regiment, there was no response. The radio net was silent, the frequencies dead. Perhaps the Germans had cut the wire. Perhaps the radio had failed. Perhaps the command post was under attack and could not respond. It did not matter. Fox could not warn the infantry directly. But he could reach the artillery fire direction center. He could still call fire. He began with the standard procedure. He identified himself, gave his position, and reported enemy movement in the village. The voice on the other end of the radio was calm, professional, detached. The fire direction center copied the coordinates, calculated the firing solution, and prepared to fire. Fox adjusted, bringing the shells closer to the German positions, walking the fire through the village in a careful, methodical pattern. Each adjustment brought the impact point closer to his own position. Each adjustment increased the danger. Artillery is not a precise instrument. A 105mm howitzer shell, the standard American field gun of World War II, has a kill radius of approximately 50 meters. Within that radius, the blast wave and fragmentation are almost certainly lethal. Beyond that radius, out to perhaps 150 meters, The shell is still dangerous, still capable of wounding or killing. And beyond that, out to 200 meters or more, there is still risk, still the possibility of a shell fragment traveling at supersonic speed, still the chance of being in the wrong place when the steel rain falls. Fox knew this. He had trained on it. He had taught it. And now, as the Germans advanced through the streets of Sommocolonia, he began to violate it. He called for fire at 300 meters, then 200 meters, then 180 meters. The shells screamed overhead and detonated in the village below, throwing up geysers of snow and stone and fire. The Germans scattered, took cover, regrouped. But they did not retreat. They were committed now, advancing toward the American positions, and they could not turn back without exposing themselves to fire from the south. Fox watched them come. He could see them clearly now, moving through the rubble, darting from building to building, advancing in short rushes. They were perhaps 120 meters away. He called in another adjustment. The fire direction center hesitated. The voice on the radio was no longer calm. It was urgent, questioning. Fox was calling fire inside the minimum safe distance. He was calling fire onto his own position. Was he sure? Was he certain of his coordinates? Fox confirmed. He was certain. Fire the mission. The shells came down at 120 meters. The blast wave rattled the walls of the stone house. Dust and debris filled the air. Fox could feel the concussion in his chest, in his bones. But the Germans were still coming. They were inside 100 meters now, close enough that he could hear individual voices, close enough that he could see the shapes of their helmets and rifles. They were too close for the infantry to stop. If they reached the American lines, they would overrun the positions, kill the defenders, retake the village, and drive the Allies back. Hundreds of American soldiers would die. The tactical situation would collapse. Fox made his decision. It was not a decision born of panic or desperation. It was a cold, rational calculation. One life against hundreds, his death against their survival. He keyed the radio one final time. He gave the fire direction center his exact coordinates. And then he said the words that would echo across more than 5 decades of silence and injustice. Fire it, there is more of them than there are of us. Give them hell. The voice on the other end of the radio protested. This was not a valid fire mission. This was suicide. This was calling fire directly onto a friendly position, directly onto an American officer. They would not execute such an order, but Fox was insistent. His voice was steady, calm, final. He repeated the coordinates. He confirmed the order, and then he waited. The artillery battalion fired. 8 guns, perhaps 10, firing in unison, sending their shells on a high arcing trajectory over the mountains and down into the village of Sommocolonia. The time of flight for a howitzer shell at that range is perhaps 30 seconds. 30 seconds to think, to pray, to regret, to accept. 30 seconds to hear the distant thump of the guns, the rising whistle of the shells, the moment of silence before impact. 30 seconds to be alive and then to be erased. The barrage fell like the wrath of an angry god. High explosive shells detonated in a sequence of overlapping blasts, each one a core of white heat expanding outward at thousands of meters per second, each one fragmenting into thousands of jagged pieces of steel moving faster than sound. The stone house where Fox sat was obliterated. The Germans advancing through the streets were killed by the dozens, their bodies shredded by shrapnel, crushed by collapsing walls, incinerated by the blast. The village itself was transformed into a smoking ruin, a landscape of shattered stone and burning wood, and the bodies of men who had been alive moments before. When the barrage lifted, when the last shell had fallen and the echoes had faded into the mountains, there was silence. The German attack had been stopped. The infiltration had been shattered. The survivors, perhaps a few dozen out of more than 100, retreated in disorder, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The American infantry, dazed and deafened by the artillery fire that had fallen so close to their own positions, advanced cautiously through the wreckage. They found German bodies everywhere. And in the rubble of the stone house on the northern edge of the village, they found the body of Lieutenant John Robert Fox. He had been killed instantly, they said. He would not have suffered, they said. These are the things soldiers say to make death seem clean and purposeful, to impose meaning on chaos, to pretend that there is dignity in being blown apart by high explosives. The truth is simpler and harder. Fox died because he chose to. He died because the mathematics demanded it. He died because 100 American lives were worth more than one, and he was the one who had to make that calculation. The men who found his body carried him out of the village and buried him with the other dead. His name was entered into the casualty lists. His belongings were packed and sent home to his wife, Arlene, who had married him before the war, who had believed he would come home, who would now spend the rest of her life as a widow. The army wrote the standard letter of condolence. They noted that he had died in action, that his service had been honorable, that his country was grateful. They did not mention the Medal of Honor. They did not mention extraordinary valor. They did not mention anything that would distinguish his death from the thousands of other deaths in that winter, in that war, in that segregated army that did not believe black men capable of heroism. For 53 years, John Robert Fox was forgotten. His name appeared in no history books. His story was told in no memoirs. The men who had survived because of his sacrifice went on with their lives, married, had children, grew old, and most of them never knew the name of the forward observer who had called fire onto his own head to save them. This was not unusual. War is a machine that consumes individuals and produces statistics. Most acts of courage go unrecorded. Most sacrifices go unhonored. But in the case of John Robert Fox, the silence was not accidental. It was structural. The United States Army of 1944 did not look for heroes among its black soldiers. It did not expect them. It did not reward them. In the years after World War II, as the nation celebrated its victory and erected monuments to its heroes, the contributions of African American soldiers were minimized or ignored. The 92nd Infantry Division was criticized in official reports, its failures highlighted, its successes dismissed. The mythology of the war, the popular culture, the films and books and monuments, centered on white soldiers, white officers, white experiences. The Buffalo Soldiers, like the Tuskegee Airmen, like the thousands of black soldiers who had served with distinction, were written out of the story. But history is not static. Memory is not fixed. In the 1980s and 1990s, historians and activists began to examine the military records of World War II, looking for evidence of overlooked heroism, of recommendations for medals that had been downgraded or denied because of the race of the recipient. They found evidence of systemic discrimination. They found cases where black soldiers had been recommended for the Medal of Honor and received lesser awards. They found cases where acts of valor had been simply ignored. In 1992, the Army commissioned a study to examine whether African American soldiers in World War II had been unfairly denied the Medal of Honor. The study reviewed thousands of records, interviewed veterans, and reconstructed forgotten battles. It identified 7 men whose actions clearly warranted the nation's highest military decoration. One of them was First Lieutenant John Robert Fox. The recommendation was forwarded through channels, reviewed by historians, confirmed by witnesses, and finally approved. On January 13, 1997, more than 52 years after his death, President Bill Clinton stood in the White House and awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 African American soldiers from World War II. One of those medals was accepted by the widow of John Robert Fox, Arlene Fox, who had waited more than half a century to see her husband's sacrifice acknowledged. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, First Lieutenant John R. Fox distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism at the risk of his own life on December 26, 1944. While serving as a forward observer, he voluntarily remained in his position and called down artillery fire on his own location to stop a German assault, sacrificing his life to save the lives of his fellow soldiers." The words are formal, bureaucratic, insufficient. They cannot capture the weight of the decision Fox made, the cold clarity with which he understood what he was doing, the 30 seconds of waiting between the order and the impact. They cannot convey the injustice of 53 years of silence, of a widow growing old without recognition, of a nation that forgot one of its heroes because his skin was the wrong color. But they are, at least, an acknowledgement. They are, at last, the truth. John Robert Fox is buried in the Custer National Cemetery in Michigan, alongside other veterans, his grave marked with a simple stone. Sommocolonia, the village where he died, is still there, rebuilt after the war, its streets narrow and quiet, its houses made of the same gray stone. There is no monument to him there. The Italians who live in the village today may not know his name, but the village stands because he died in it. The roads are open because he closed them. The children playing in the square are alive because their grandparents survived a war in which a young American officer chose mathematics over survival and won life over hundreds. What does courage cost? It costs everything. It costs the future, the children never born, the years never lived, the old age never reached. It costs the wife who waits, the mother who grieves, the father who buries his son. And sometimes it costs even more than that. Sometimes it costs 53 years of silence, of being erased, of being forgotten by the nation you died to defend. John Robert Fox paid that price. And then, at last, decades too late, his country acknowledged the debt. So now I ask you, what do you think about Lieutenant Fox's decision? Was it the right choice, the only choice, or something more complicated than right and wrong? Do you believe that recognition delayed for more than half a century is justice, or is it simply another wound, another reminder that some lives are valued less than others? These are not easy questions. They do not have easy answers, but they are worth considering, worth discussing, worth remembering. If you found this story meaningful, if it made you think or feel something, please consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a like on this video if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. And in the comments below, please share your thoughts about John Robert Fox and let me know which city, state, or country you are watching from. History is not just dates and battles. It is the choices people made, the prices they paid, and the silences we choose to break. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering.